Well, good morning, Facebook. I want to welcome you to the Thursday, March 6th edition of 5 Minutes of Hope from St. John Lutheran Church here in Luxembourg, Wisconsin. As today we are continuing our discussion on the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. And we're going to be diving into Abraham. In fact, we're going to talk about him not only today, but we're also going to pick up on him some more tomorrow. But the point that the author to the Hebrews, or the Hebrew writer, is making as he's trying to write to his fellow Hebrew people, not only in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of their faith. Okay, that's the key element here. It's not just that they were Jewish or Hebrew, it's that this was their faith that they practiced, that they believed. He's trying to connect the Old Testament Hebrew faith to its fulfillment in Christ. That this is always the cross, and Jesus was always what everything in the Old Testament was pointing ahead to, that this is the true fulfillment of what God was doing back then. So let's open up to Hebrews 11, and we'll start at verse 8 together. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of a promise, or in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. So there's allegory and there is literal understanding to a lot of what the Hebrew writer is saying here. So let's just dive into verses 8 through 12 at first, okay? And these are more of the literal things, okay? Abraham was called by God. He was living in Ur of the Chaldeans, or Chaldeans, depending on how you want to say it. Basically, this is part of modern-day Iraq. It was later considered part of the Persian Empire. In fact, this is where the great warriors arose, and the greatest minds of the Persian Empire arose from, the Chaldeans. But Abraham was called by God to leave there. Okay, to leave that land, to go to a land that he did not know, a land he had never been to before, and that God would eventually give as an inheritance to his descendants. So Abraham does. He picks up his wife, they head out. Apparently he must have brought along some others as well, because we have his nephew involved. But they go to Ur, and basically there, God fulfills his promise to him. Now, it doesn't happen quite as clean, we could say, as what is described here. They were not, they did sojourn. So they were aliens in a foreign land, okay? They were not, it was not their land yet. They had not purchased it, or were not given ownership over it. So they were aliens in a foreign land. They, went around in tents, in nomadic lifestyle in that land. But God also promised not only to give him this land, but to give him descendants as numerous as the stars. And the writer makes reference to that here in verse 12. But when having read the book of Genesis, we know that there's more to this story, right? That Abraham and Sarah struggled to become pregnant. They're both old when when the Lord promises and takes them to this land, and when the Lord promises that they will have a son, that they will have descendants. And so at first we know Sarah encourages Abraham to take matters into their own hands. He sleeps with Sarah's handmaiden, and they have Ishmael, right? But that is not the fulfillment of God's promise. Ishmael is not considered the firstborn because he's not the firstborn from Sarah. God's promise was through Sarah. So, contrary to what the Quran says, this is, the understanding, the biblical understanding is that the promise came through Abraham and Sarah. It came to both of them, and it is fulfilled in Isaac. Now, what we don't always understand today is that Abraham was still alive for quite a while after the narrative switches to Isaac and later to Jacob. Abraham's still around. He lived for quite a while. He's into several, maybe 250 years old. And so that's something we don't always realize because the narrative kind of switches to somebody else, and Abraham's not mentioned. Abraham and Sarah are not mentioned anymore. But Sarah eventually conceives, by the hand of God, meaning God allows her and Abraham to have a child. It's Isaac. We're going to come back to that tomorrow, kind of more on that interaction. But basically, verse 12 really narrows in on the fact that here, through this one man, and him and his wife as good as dead, were born all of the ancestors, all the parents, grandparents, great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents of the Israelite people, the Hebrew people that this writer is writing to. So then he moves to verse 13. He says, look, all of these people, all of these Hall of Fame, if you will, kind of using modern context, Hall of Fame believers, they all died in faith, not having actually received the promise. And what he means by that, let's use the example of Abraham, for instance, okay? While the fulfillment of Abraham and Sarah, the promise to them that they would have a son, that was fulfilled. There was the bigger and deeper promise that they would have a land that would be theirs and their descendants. That was not fulfilled during Abraham's lifetime. That would not be fulfilled until generations, like maybe 15 generations later, when after the Exodus, the Israelites come back under, and eventually take possession of the land. In its truest sense, this takes place under King David and Solomon, that the land is finally established and it belongs to Israel. Okay, so that's what the author's referencing here. That look, they didn't possess the land, and the land was synonymous with God's promise, the fulfillment of God's promise. But they looked for it, and they were always, they even died in the faith and hope that God would keep his promise, and one day this land would be their descendants. And then it goes into this allegory over this homeland. Okay, now one of the let me kind of step aside for a second, get into an aside for a second. One of the false allegories, one of the false connections that has been made in history. Okay, and I'm not bashing the history of our country, United States of America, but there has been this false assumption that the United States is a new promised land. That is not the case. Okay, there is no biblical connection for that, and the reason I'm saying that is, yes, there are some Christian groups that get off into these weird tangents saying that the United States will be a new heaven on earth. No, it's not. Okay, and don't get me wrong, I love my country and want it to be the best country it can be, but I am not fooled into thinking that this is the promised land, okay? Because the promised land is the new heaven and the new earth. And that's the key distinction here. When I said that some of this is understood literally and some of this is understood figuratively or allegorically, verse 16 is especially understood in an allegorical and literal sense. And what I mean by that is that Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that was established under King David, then the city built up and then later rebuilt with Ezra and Nehemiah after it had been sacked. Jerusalem in the Old Testament is not the fulfillment of what God promised. The new city is the Jerusalem described in the book of Revelation, which is where the Lord will be. The new heavens, the new earth, the new Mount Zion, the new Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem is on Mount Zion, and at the very peak is the temple. Well, the picture that we were given in the book of Revelation is Jesus sitting on his throne, the pinnacle of Mount Zion, and flowing down from him is the river of life that gives life to everything else, life and nurturing to everything, both the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles of Christ. And Jesus is the light. There is no more need for sun or moon or stars. Jesus is the light in this city. Okay, so this city is not a literal, this side of death, this side of Jesus' second coming place. This city is the place that Jesus will build when he comes again and recreates all things. Okay, when he does away with finally sin, death, and the devil, all that is cast out where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so the point of the author is to connect that this better country isn't a restored Israel, as the Israelites not only were looking for pre-Christ, but post-Christ, especially post AD 69, when Jerusalem is sacked by the Romans. And so, today, for instance, even though we have a restored country of Israel, it is not to its historical limits, okay? But the temple has not been restored, probably will never be restored in Jerusalem. And even if it were, that is not the city that is talked about here in our text. The city is this future Jerusalem, this future Zion, that will come when Jesus comes again. And so what is our hope? Well, through the writer's perspective, what he's telling us is our hope is much the same as the hope of these elders, these people of old, this Hall of Fame believers. Our hope is always in God's promise and the fulfillment of that promise that is yet to come. We have a glimpse of it in that Jesus died and rose. Okay, he's the firstborn of the dead. We have a glimpse of it. We have the actions been taken that was necessary to make us be able to go to heaven. Now it's waiting for the day when he comes again, the trumpet sounds, and indeed heaven and earth are restored to their true, they're remade in the true way that God wanted them to be before sin and the fall. Just my 2 cents on a Thursday. We'll pick up here then tomorrow. I'm going to stop early without a prayer today. Sorry, guys.